A human rights expert, though, told us serious crime is on the rise in gang crime, and wiretapping innocent citizens is not going to be the answer here.
Well, criminality in Sweden, it's an issue of reasonable concern. I mean, the first half of this year, we have in Sweden about same number of killings in the gang criminality circuit than those we had in the entirely past year and also in the year previous to that one. So the problem is huge. However, not primarily, in my opinion, via a menace to the civil liberties of the population. It's a population which comprises the vast majority of the immigrants in Sweden, and that has nothing to do with the criminal behaviors. On and on, the government has tried to deny the issue of gang criminality among immigrants. And for instance, it has forbidden to present public statistics where ethnicity of the perpetrators of criminal and violent deeds could be revealed.
Well, in my opinion, it would be reasonable to wiretap, of course in accordance to a court authorization, communications in which there are tenable suspicions of criminal or terrorist activities. However, I strongly oppose the indiscriminatory surveillance against citizens which are not suspected of any crime. That would be an infringement in the civil rights of the citizens and also their fundamental human rights.
A recent interview in Swedish radio with the deputy director of the Swedish Police Authority
revealed that the kind of criminality here in discussion, namely gang criminality, also called clan criminality, principally occurs in main city suburbs considered socially less favored areas or vulnerable zones, in Swedish utsatta områden. The problem is primarily social and therefore the concern of political decisions. And here we come back to the original problem, which is an issue of idiosyncratic nature, I would say. The apparently detachment of Swedish politicians, including the government, regarding responsibilities that their previous opportunist decisions have brought about in the Swedish society as a whole. A core issue here is the positions of the authorities towards the acculturation mess they have occasioned in Sweden via their ill-fated decisions regarding the mass migration of 2015 and partly 2016 and onwards. Undoubtedly, we have that the rising of criminality of this type has been associated with migration issues, to which integration flaws belong to. I would like to stress, however, that the issue is not immigrants per se, which in its vast majority they are law-abiding, and those immigrants, if given the opportunity, they would work as hard and as honest as any Swedish-born individual. And by the way, a vast proportion of so-called immigrants are born in Sweden. I thought they are considered, and name it, or treated by many, as second-generation immigrants. So, as I see it, the issue is primarily the integration versus rejection of the immigrant class. Concomitantly, another important issue would be to inquire into the perceptions and feelings these immigrant classes perceive as hostile or unfriendly from the part of the host populations, the Swedes. This would be interesting because Swedes may have idiosyncratic behaviors, including among members of its own culture, that may be understood as non-friendly by people from other cultures. And I would extend this investigation aiming to understand how the immigrants perceive the Swedish authorities, the bureaucrats, politicians, etc. What is the psychological effect, and therefore the behavioral effect of this apparent civic or societal disharmony? Would be from those experiences of rejection that these vulnerable individuals, the authorities say they live in vulnerable areas, turn to antisocial deeds? Are those individuals the social force from where hardcore criminals recruit partly their client sphere and partly their criminal proxies? Well, they surely have the data to support that conclusion. Not any surprise there. Sweden is unlike anywhere in Europe in a series of issues. Take, for instance, the Swedish management of the current pandemic, or historically, Sweden's main geopolitical stances from its position towards the Third Reich during World War II up to now, when it's leading in Europe the demands on increasing sanctions against Russia, for example. So, what was unlike other countries in Europe, really? It was not only the massive number of migrants that Sweden took in around the half of last decade, principally around 2015, 2016. What was most unlike the rest of Europe and the world, I guess, was that 80% of migrants, to be exact, 84.4% of migrants that the Swedish authorities allowed into the country did not have any identification papers. I mean, you would not know where those migrants really came from, why they came, who were they, etc. So that is not only naivety, that is utter irresponsibility from the part of the Swedish political authorities. I remember so well that Sweden's Prime Minister Löfven said at that opportunity, we have been naive. Vi har varit naiva. What that helps.
Sverige nog har varit naiva i det här avseendet.
Sverige nog har varit naiva.
You might wonder how that happened, and if you would allow me a little bit of context here. This is here. This is what happened. Sweden was at a time, and nowadays I guess still is, an staunch supporter of the war for regime change and oil for the West that the United States and other principal NATO countries waged via jihadist proxies against the government of Syria. Well, parallel to the advances of the Syrian governmental forces, which at a given moment, after the support received by Russian armed forces, they were advancing quite strongly in the recapturing of its Syrian territory. Well, at that time, at that moment, the United States and other NATO allies made the narrative that those who fled during that period of the war in Syria were victims of the Assad regime, and they needed shelter just precisely in Europe. The Swedish authorities, or simply swallowed the narrative by means of sheer naivety, okay? B, they were consciously taking the opportunity to show Sweden was the humanitarian superpower as defined by Carl Bildt's rhetoric. Or C, Sweden saw a possibility of confronting Russia by helping Assad's enemies, I mean the Syrian refugees, without the need of participating more actively in the war. I would say the so-called Syrian refugees, because, as I would like to review later on, the majority of the migrants in the wave of 2015 were not the people from Syria. Well, it should be noticed that Sweden has, at least since 2014, been leader in Europe in agitating an increasing of economic sanctions against Russia, for whatever reason at stake. In my belief, an anti-Russian stance confused the hearts and therefore blind the minds of politicians, also regarding their media and the corresponding cultural elites in Sweden. This is rather self-destructive because, in my opinion, this only harmed the interest of Sweden as a country. I would feel much more comfortable with the stance taken by the former Prime Minister, the great former Prime Minister of Sweden, Olof Palme. And he's advocating, at least diplomatically, for non-alignment and neutrality. Okay, but for whatever reason, what I have mentioned before or other reasons, the fact is that over 160,000 migrants were received as refugees in Sweden. In addition, the fact is that the majority of those migrants did not come from Syria, as I said. And the Swedish authorities swallowed all that, despite the United Nations different conventions referring causal for political asylum, in nowhere stipulate that fleeing from a combat zone is a causal for political asylum. Political asylum should be given, according to international conventions, only to individuals persecuted for its political ideas, religious activities, political activities, and so on. Meaning, economic migrants are definitely not in the list. What is needed is a radical change in the mindset of Swedish politicians and the cultural elites in some symbiosis with them. It is also a fact that the gang criminality has increased in the later years. Based on that, I would instead blame the Swedish politicians that led in the country that enormous amount of migrants without knowing who they were, from where they came from, etc. Secondly, as I mentioned it, I blame the politicians for not taking seriously and with civic responsibility the issues of integration, the issues of racism, the issues of negative sentiments from the part of sectors of the immigrant population that feels and experience sheer marginalization in society. social ostracism, arbitrariness in the labor market, in the common life activities, even among academia, etc. So, ending structural racism in Sweden, at the same time that hardening the combat against criminals, would be a way to get rid of the problem in the long run. The day that immigrants are not immigrants, but Swedish citizens honored as such, with the same rights, the same housing, the same education, etc., that day the hard criminals shall have real difficulty to recruit proxies, to sell their drugs, and to stir hate among humans.